The discovery in Dead Man's Bayou. Morning mist draped the water like a funeral veil as Jacob Landry eased his boat through the narrow cuts of Dead Man's Bayou. Early September, peak gator season, the air thick with humidity and the promise of a solid haul. Jacob had been running lines in these waters since he could barely hold a rod, learning every twist and hidden spot from his father and grandfather before him. The swamp was in his blood, beating the same rhythm as his own heart, but today something felt wrong. The cypress trees seemed to lean in tighter, Spanish moss hanging like caution flags in the dead still air. The usual symphony of birds and bugs had fallen silent, leaving only the low growl of his outboard slicing through the quiet. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp was trying to warn him that he reached his first line, marked by a white buoy drifting lazily in the tea-colored water. The line felt unusually heavy, heavier than any normal catch, and his pulse kicked up with anticipation. Could be a monster bull gator, 12 feet or better. Those were the ones that made the whole brutal season worth it, the ones with enough hide and meat to justify the danger and exhaustion. As he pulled hand over hand, the weight shifted in a way that felt completely off. Gators fight hard, thrash wildly, tails whipping the water into white foam. This was dead weight, limp and lifeless. Jacob's stomach began to knot with a cold, nameless dread. When the object finally broke the surface, Jacob's breath locked in his throat. It wasn't a gator. Tangled in his line was a large waterproof duffel bag, sealed tight and weighed down with what felt like chains. Military-issue olive green, and surprisingly clean-looking for something that had been underwater. Whoever put it there had gone to serious trouble to make sure it stayed hidden on the bottom of the bayou. Jacob's mind raced. He'd grown up hearing the old stories, tales of people using the endless waterways to make problems disappear forever. Most were just ghost stories meant to keep kids away from dangerous places. But the bag staring back at him was real, and every instinct screamed at him to cut the line and pretend he'd never seen it. Instead, he dragged it into the boat, water cascading off its sides. His hands shook as he reached for the zipper, already knowing whatever was inside would change everything. Secrets between brothers. Jacob didn't open the bag on the water. Some truths need solid ground under your feet, and this was one of them. He fired up the engine and headed back to the family dock, the mysterious duffel bag lying in the bottom of the boat like a coiled rattlesnake. The ride back felt like it took forever, his mind spinning darker and darker possibilities about what he might find inside. The Landry family compound sat on a rare high spot that had belonged to the family for 5 generations. The main house, a weathered, stilt-raised building built to survive seasonal floods, stood surrounded by sheds, boat houses, and processing shacks. This was where the Landrys cleaned their catches, fixed gear, and gathered after long days on the water. As Jacob tied off, he saw his younger brother Chase walking down from the main house, coffee mug in hand. Chase was 2 years younger than Jacob's 38, but swamp life had aged them both far beyond their years. Where Jacob was careful and methodical, Chase had always been the hothead, quick to act, slow to think about fallout. Chase called out a casual greeting, but his grin vanished the instant he saw Jacob's face. The brothers had always been able to read each other, a survival skill when you're wrestling 12-foot alligators side by side. Jacob motioned him over, keeping his voice low even though no one else was around. He told Chase about the bag, about how heavy it felt, about how deliberately it had been hidden. Chase's expression shifted, curiosity turning into something harder, something that made Jacob's stomach twist tighter. Before Jacob could stop him, Chase reached into the boat, grabbed the bag, and hauled it onto the dock with a grunt. The metallic clank inside confirmed Jacob's suspicion about chains being used as weight. Chase found the zipper and yanked it open before Jacob could object. They both stared in stunned silence. Bundles of cash, thick stacks of $100 bills wrapped in plastic, filled more than half the bag. Beneath the money, carefully wrapped and sealed, were several packages Jacob instantly recognized as drugs. The sheer quantity made it obvious. this wasn't some small-time stash. This was serious money. Serious product. Serious trouble. Chase let out a low whistle, eyes wide. He reached for one of the cash bundles, but Jacob clamped down hard on his wrist, hard enough to make his brother wince. They locked eyes, and Jacob saw something in Chase's expression that turned his blood to ice. His brother wasn't shocked. He wasn't scared. He was calculating. Chase pulled his arm free and stepped back, jaw set in that stubborn way that had gotten him into trouble since they were kids. He argued the bag had been underwater for who knows how long. Whoever put it there was probably long gone or dead. The swamp had handed them a gift, he said, and they'd be fools not to take it. They could pay off boat loans, upgrade gear, maybe even expand the business. No one would ever know. Jacob felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't just about found contraband anymore. This was about who his brother really was, and whether Chase had somehow known this bag was waiting out there. The questions burned in Jacob's throat, but he couldn't force them out. Not yet. Because once he asked, once he heard the answers, there would be no going back. Instead, Jacob told Chase to zip the bag shut and say nothing to anyone until he figured out what to do. Chase agreed, but there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, or maybe Jacob was only seeing it clearly now. The weight of the Landry legacy. Jacob spent the rest of the day going through the motions, checking lines, tagging gators, trying to act normal while his mind spun with darkness. He stashed the duffel bag in one of the older storage sheds behind equipment that hadn't been touched in years. Every few hours he'd walk back to check the lock, making sure the secret stayed contained. That evening the family gathered for dinner at the main house, their nightly ritual during gator season. Jacob's father, Don Landry, sat at the head of the long wooden table his own grandfather had built. At 72, Don was still razor-sharp, his eyes missing nothing even if his body could no longer keep up with the swamp's demands. Jacob's mother had passed 5 years earlier, and Don had never fully recovered, though he hid his grief behind gruff commands and tough love. Chase sat across from Jacob, pushing food around his plate and avoiding eye contact. Their sister Leah was there with her husband and 2 kids, filling the room with the everyday family noise that suddenly felt surreal given what Jacob knew. Uncle Ray, Don's younger brother, held court at the far end of the table, spinning exaggerated stories about gators he'd caught back in the day. Jacob watched his father's weathered face as Don talked about season quotas, market prices for meat and hides, and keeping the family's reputation for quality and honesty. The Landry name meant something in these parts. 5 generations of hard work, fair dealing, and respect for the swamp had built a legacy worth more than money, and now Jacob sat there carrying knowledge that could destroy it all. If that bag was somehow connected to the family, if Chase or anyone else had been involved in whatever criminal operation it represented, the fallout would be devastating, even if they weren't directly tied to it. Just having the bag found on Landry property could bring law enforcement scrutiny, taint the family name with suspicion, and ruin their reputation in a tight-knit community where trust was everything. After dinner, Don asked Jacob to join him on the porch, just the 2 of them. It was their old ritual, one they'd kept since Jacob was a teenager. They'd sit in the weathered rocking chairs, listen to the night sounds of the swamp, and talk about whatever needed talking about. Usually it was business, plans for tomorrow's hunt, gear that needed fixing. Sometimes it was deeper, life lessons Don wanted to pass down before time ran out. Tonight Don sensed something was wrong. He asked Jacob straight, was there trouble? Had something happened on the water? Jacob's throat tightened with the urge to confess everything, to lay the whole burden at his father's feet and let the old man's wisdom guide him. Don had always known what to do, always steered the family through rough water with a steady hand, but looking at his father's face, seeing the deep lines carved by 72 years of hard living, Jacob couldn't add this weight to the load Don already carried. The old man had earned his peace, earned the right to enjoy his final years without being dragged into whatever mess Jacob had uncovered. So Jacob lied. Said everything was fine, just tired from a long day on the water. Don didn't believe him. Jacob could see it in the narrowing of his father's eyes, the slight shake of his head, but Don also knew when to let his sons wrestle their own problems. That he told Jacob that whatever was eating at him, whatever choice he was struggling with, he should remember who he was and where he came from. A Landry does the right thing, Don said. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Those words echoed in Jacob's head long after he said goodnight and walked to his cabin on the edge of the property. That he lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing sleep wouldn't come easy. The right thing. That it sounded so simple when his father said it, but the reality was far more tangled. If he turned the bag over to authorities, questions would follow. How long had it been there? Had he checked his lines regularly? Could he prove he didn't know about it? And then there was Chase. Jacob didn't know the full extent of his brother's connection to the bag, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Chase knew more than he was admitting. Turning it in could mean turning in his brother, and if it came to that, could Jacob really do it? Could he put blood behind bars to do the right thing? When blood runs cold, Jacob woke before dawn after maybe 2 hours of restless sleep. He brewed strong coffee and sat on his porch, watching the sky slowly lighten over the swamp. In a few hours he'd have to head back out to check the rest of his lines, keep up the appearance of normal while his world quietly collapsed. But first he needed answers. He found Chase in the boathouse, supposedly working on one of the engines. His brother looked up as Jacob entered, and the flash of guilt across his face confirmed Jacob's worst fears. Chase knew something. Had been involved somehow. The weight of that knowledge sat between them like a living thing. Jacob closed the door and locked it, making sure no one could interrupt. He asked Chase directly. No more dancing around it. How long had he known about the bag? What was he mixed up in? And most importantly, who did the bag belong to? Chase tried to deflect at first, claimed he didn't know what Jacob was talking about, but the lie was paper thin. Jacob stepped closer, voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. He reminded Chase who they were, the legacy they were supposed to protect. Their father had built something real, something honest. Whatever Chase had gotten tangled in threatened to destroy it all. The dam finally broke. Chase slumped against the workbench, defenses crumbling. He admitted he'd been approached 6 months earlier by men from New Orleans. They'd offered easy money to use the family's boats and knowledge of the swamp for occasional runs, just transport, Chase insisted. Nothing violent. Nothing that hurt anyone. The money had been too good to turn down, especially with Chase's mounting gambling debts he'd kept hidden from the family. Jacob felt his stomach drop. His brother hadn't just stumbled into trouble. He'd actively participated, used the family name and resources for criminal activity. The betrayal cut deeper than Jacob could have imagined. Chase kept talking, said the last run had gone wrong. Something spooked his contacts. They told him to dump everything in the bayou until things cooled off. They'd given him coordinates, specific drop spots where the bags could be retrieved later, but then the contacts vanished, stopped answering calls, and Chase had been too scared to do anything about it. Jacob asked how many bags there were. Chase hesitated, then admitted there were 3 more scattered across different sections of the swamp the Landrys regularly worked. Jacob closed his eyes, trying to grasp the scale of what his brother had done. It wasn't one bag. One mistake. It was a pattern of deception that had been running for months, right under their noses. The worst part was that Chase still didn't seem to fully understand the danger. He kept talking about the money, how they could still salvage it if they retrieved the other bags and cut out the middlemen. Take the cash, dump the drugs somewhere far from Landry property. Pay off his debts. Have enough left to set themselves up for years. Jacob stared at his brother like he was looking at a stranger. This wasn't the kid he'd taught to fish. The teenager he'd protected from bullies. The young man who'd stood beside him at their mother's funeral. Or maybe it was, and Jacob had just been too blind to see who Chase really was underneath. He told Chase in no uncertain terms, they were doing the right thing. They would retrieve all the bags. Then Jacob would figure out how to handle it. Chase started to argue, but Jacob silenced him with a look that could have frozen the bayou in July. This wasn't up for debate, but even as he laid down the law, Jacob knew the situation was far more complicated than simply handing over evidence that if Chase had been working with dangerous people connected enough to move that kind of product, they wouldn't take kindly to losing their merchandise, and if those people thought Chase had stolen from them, or cooperated with police, the entire Landry family could become targets. Jacob was trapped between his moral duty to do right and his primal instinct to protect his blood. Somewhere in that impossible middle ground, he would have to find a path that didn't destroy everything his ancestors had built. Confrontation at the family dock. Over the next 3 days, Jacob and Chase worked in tense silence to recover the remaining bags. Each one felt heavier than the last, not because of physical weight, but because of what they represented. By the time they pulled the fourth and final bag from the murky water, Jacob had a plan. It wasn't perfect. It carried risks that made his blood run cold. But it was the only way he could see to protect both his family and his conscience that he decided to tell his father everything. The secret had grown too big to carry alone, and if anyone would know how to navigate these deadly waters, it was Don Landry. The old man had lived through hard times, made impossible choices, and always come out with his integrity intact. Jacob needed that wisdom now more than ever. He called a family meeting for that evening, told everyone it was important. When they gathered in the main house, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Don sat in his usual chair, Uncle Ray beside him. Leia on the couch, arms crossed. Chase stood near the door, looking like he wanted to run. Jacob stood in the center of the room, the weight of what he was about to say pressing down on him. He laid it all out: the discovery of the first bag, Chase's confession, the recovery of the others. He showed them photographs he'd taken of the contents, kept the actual bags hidden for safety. As he spoke, he watched his father's face go from confusion to shock to something harder and colder than Jacob had ever seen. Don didn't explode in anger like Jacob feared. Instead, the old man went quiet, jaw working as he processed. Uncle Ray started to speak. Don raised a hand for silence. The room waited. The only sounds were the ticking of the old mantel clock and distant night birds from the swamp. When Don finally spoke, his voice was measured and low. He looked at Chase and asked one question. Why? Why would his son risk everything they'd built for quick money? Why would he bring this poison into their lives? Chase tried to explain. The debts, feeling like he couldn't measure up to Jacob's success, wanting to prove he could make big money too, but the words sounded empty even to him. Don listened without interrupting. When Chase finished, the old man simply shook his head. Then Don turned to Jacob, and for a moment Jacob saw pride flash in his father's eyes. Pride that at least one son had wrestled with the moral weight of the situation instead of seeing only dollar signs. But pride couldn't fix what was broken. The family debated late into the night. Uncle Ray argued for dumping everything back in the swamp and pretending it never happened. Leia wanted to call the police immediately. Consequences be damned. Chase begged for another chance, swore he'd make it right if they just gave him time. But it was Don's decision that mattered most, and the old man sat silent while the storm raged around him. Finally, as midnight approached, Don made his ruling. They would turn everything over to the authorities, but they would do it smartly. Don had a contact, a retired DEA agent who'd settled in the area and occasionally hired Landry boats for fishing trips. This man could be trusted to handle things discreetly, help protect the family name while making sure the evidence reached the right hands. But there was a price. Chase would have to cooperate fully, provide information about his contacts and testify if needed. He would likely face charges, though Don would hire the best lawyer they could afford. The family would weather the storm together, but Chase would have to accept responsibility for what he'd done. Jacob watched his brother's face collapse as the reality sank in. Part of him felt grim satisfaction that Chase would finally face consequences, but a larger part, the part that remembered teaching Chase to tie knots and checking for monsters under his bed, ached with grief for what was lost. Don stood, signaling the meeting was over. He told Chase he was disappointed. Told him he'd broken trust that might never fully mend, but he also said Chase was still his son, still a Landry, and the family would stand by him through whatever came next. There were tears then, hard men crying without shame, a family breaking and beginning to heal at the same time. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, needing air, needing space from the emotional weight inside. His father joined him a few minutes later. They stood together in silence, watching moonlight reflect off the dark bayou water. Don put a hand on Jacob's shoulder and squeezed, a gesture that said more than words ever could. Pride, gratitude, sorrow, all mixed together, healing the divide. The next few weeks were among the hardest Jacob had ever lived through, harder even than losing his mother. Don's contact, a grizzled former DEA agent named Marcus Webb, took possession of the bags and promised to handle things as quietly as possible. Chase was interviewed extensively, gave names, details about the operation he'd been pulled into. Authorities assured the family that Chase's cooperation would be considered, but there were no guarantees. About charges or sentences, the Landry name took a hit. Word spread fast through the tight-knit community, as it always does in small towns where everyone knows everyone's business. Some longtime clients pulled contracts, unwilling to associate with a family touched by scandal. Business dropped nearly 40% in the first month. Jacob worked double shifts to make up the difference, running lines from before dawn until long after dark. But something unexpected happened to other families. People who'd made mistakes and fought their way back, reached out with support. They brought food, offered help with repairs, shared their own stories of redemption and second chances. The community Jacob had feared would reject them instead wrapped around them with surprising strength. Don aged 10 years in those weeks. The stress and disappointment carved new lines in his face, dimmed the fire in his eyes, but he never once spoke of disowning Chase, never suggested they cut him loose to save the business. The Landry takes care of their own, he said. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Chase himself seemed to change. The cocky, reckless younger brother gave way to someone more serious, more aware of consequences. He threw himself into work, into repairing what he'd damaged. Attended counseling for his gambling addiction. Joined a support group. Began the long process of making amends. The relationship between Jacob and Chase remained strained. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal overnight. There were still moments of anger, flashes of resentment, when Jacob looked at his brother and remembered all the lies, but there were also moments of connection, brief glimpses of the bond they'd once shared. It would take time, maybe years, but Jacob could see a path where they might truly be brothers again. 3 months after the discovery, Chase was sentenced to 2 years probation in community service. It was lighter than it could have been. Thanks to his full cooperation and the fact he'd never actually distributed any drugs, the sentence included regular drug testing, mandatory counseling, and a restriction on leaving the parish without permission. It wasn't prison, but it wasn't freedom either. The day the sentence came down, the family gathered again at the main house. Don raised a glass of whiskey and offered a toast, not to celebrate, he clarified, but to survive. To face hard truths and do right, even when it cost them dearly. To be Landry's, which meant something more than just a name on a mailbox. Jacob sat on the dock that evening, feet dangling over the water, watching the sun set across the swamp he loved. Chase approached hesitantly, asked if he could join him. Jacob nodded. They sat in silence for a long while, two brothers trying to find their way back to each other. Chase broke the quiet first, voice thick with emotion. He apologized again. Not with desperate pleading to avoid consequences, but with genuine remorse for what he'd cost others. He told Jacob he didn't expect forgiveness, didn't deserve it, but hoped someday they could rebuild what he'd broken. Jacob didn't answer right away. He thought about everything that had happened, the choices he'd made, the prices he'd paid. That he thought about his father's words about doing right, even when it's hard, and he realized forgiveness was part of that. Maybe the hardest part. That he told Chase it would take time, that trust had to be earned back slowly, but he also said they were brothers, would always be brothers, and that meant something. That it meant showing up, doing the work, believing people could change if they really wanted to. As darkness fell over the bayou, Jacob felt something shift inside him. The anger was still there, probably always would be in some form, but it no longer consumed him. He'd faced an impossible choice and made the best decision he could. He'd stood up for what was right, protected his family, and forced his brother to face consequences. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but life rarely offers perfect. The swamp stretched out before them, dark, mysterious, full of secrets, but for the first time in months, Jacob looked at it without dread. It was still his home. Still the place where 5 generations of Landrys had carved out a life, and it would be there for generations to come, holding its secrets, testing the character of those who dared to work its waters. Some things you can control, some things you can't. All you can do is face each day with integrity, make the best choices you can, and trust that doing right will eventually lead you through the darkness into light. The Landry family's journey reminds us that even in our darkest moments, choosing integrity over convenience defines who we truly are. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales from the bayou. Drop a comment below, tell us what you would have done in Jacob's position. Would you have protected your family at all costs, or done what Jacob did? We'll see you in the next video where we dive deeper into the untold stories of swamp people. Music fades.